Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Viewer Spore Creations Reborn, where I recreate your Spore creations that you may submit to my Discord server via the Remaking Creations channel, the one with the little star in it. Fair warning, I've been sick recently, so if I sound a little bit tired or whatever, I do apologise, bear with me. And so, for our very first creation, we have the Palapeos by Helsk. This is a fun-looking, very colourful raptor-like creature, so I had quite a bit of fun remaking this one. As for the creation process, it begins, as you might expect, with a typical raptor body, in which I made the tail using limbs, went for a very nice, prideful kind of body stance, and used different combinations of limbs attached by holding control, so that I can attach and reattach limbs and make like my little custom combinations of such. The head that they used for the Palapeos was a really interesting, creepy and cute one that you don't really see very often, and it's also one that I have a very hard time customizing. So the head on this creature end up being fairly true to the original, whereas for the adornments I really tried to go a little bit more crazy with what they had originally, using a lot of the flippy part for the cresting because I wanted to have like quite a nice bright coloration, and that part tends to translate colors really nicely. They had a bit of webbing on the arms and legs in a similar way you'd have cresting of feathers on a raptor. They had a sort of a bat boy webbing integument going on, so I decided to keep that in and just kind of made it larger instead, and I added a couple of the whip wicks on. That way you had like these long little tendrils and it just made the webbing look a little bit more extravagant, as well as adding overall mass to the creation. Especially around the tail, I had quite a bit of fun making the tail just overall broader. I don't know what it is, you definitely see this with my Jowie, but also a lot of other creatures. I just love raptors having really large, heavy plumage on their tails. Something about it just seems really satisfying, and I definitely did the same thing here as well. And since I really enjoyed Helsk's original creation design, I didn't want to deviate too much, so as I've done with a couple of previous Reborn creations, I just looked to add a little bit of extra detail here and there just to kind of complement what's already existing, such as a couple of shell shards added along the spine and hips parallel to the existing osteoflippy. And then when it came to the coloration, I did deviate quite a bit from the original one because as I was fiddling around and trying to get different combinations and patterns, Helsk's original Palapeos is stripy, and my one does have a bit of a stripiness to it, but eventually I found a spotted texture that I just saw just suited it really well. So while it isn't quite as stripy as the original, I do think it is still just as colourful and it complements the entire creature nicely. I'd say this one here is a really lovely start to the episode. And next up we got a Sporealis by Killer Monitor. This is a really cool alien looking creature that kind of had me stumped, since the original design was just really solid the way it was. It kind of reminded me of the horses from Avatar, and the way it was designed just really had me a bit of a loss as to what I could add to it. So in the end I kind of took the existing features and just multiplied them. I love the posing. In Killer Monitor's original one, the posing looked a little bit hunched forward, which I can understand as the head does look very heavy, and it made the creature look a little bit timid, but I also could see such a grace in the design. So for my one, I went with a bit more of an antelope kind of posture. And granted, it does mean that the head no longer looks quite as weighted down, and it means that the spine on my one is very different. I still quite like both approaches, and I thought it'd be nice to experiment with a different type of body language overall. So I mimicked the arms and legs in slightly different positions. I mimicked the entirety of the head because I loved their original head design, all the crazy large claws and pincers. I'm not really sure what you'd call them, I just love the way it looks. So I kept it true to the original, but I basically just took the existing details and integument and just really duplicated it, just to give it a bit more flair. As I mentioned before, some of these recreations, I kind of imagine a little bit like a Pokemon, where it goes from like middle to large evolution, and this is what I would imagine to be a larger evolution of Killer Monitor's original Sporealis, where it really looks a lot like the original, just with more spikes, or in this case more parts. I added a little bit of armor going down the back just to give it a bit of extra texture, and I added a couple of the whisker parts from Creepy and Cute just to give it a bit more, I guess, kind of a fur in a way, since like I said, I really just wanted to add like a bit more weight to everything overall, just have a bit more to look at. But ultimately I did really abuse the mantenna part along the head cresting and the back, and gave it a little tail as well, just to really drive home that alien look. And in the end, I think I got a rather majestic looking creature, which I'm quite happy with and adds for a very lovely variety for this video. Now for our third creation, we had the Hydra by Dragon Slayer Alex. Now as we all know, Hydras are actually my favourite mythical creature, so I couldn't quite hold back on this one. I did definitely make it just like a much larger overall creation. I went with my very typical kind of proud dragon looking posing, one that is arguably a little bit too skinny for this, but I quite like the way it looks in the end. However, Alex's Hydra has a bit of a split tail where it's got two different tails, so that's always a fun change of pace. When it came to the heads, I had a fair bit of freedom to go with, because he used a crocodile head with the keratin horns, and that's basically about it, which is very understandable because in a vanilla complexity limit creature, you really can't add a lot to a Hydra. They are so restricted. So for my one, I stuck with the crocodile heads and I gave it all like a bit of a cresting. I kept in the keratin horns and made them larger, added a couple of horror lumps to try and merge it all together, as well as just more crusting in general, and the Phineas parts to give like big angry eyebrows, which I don't know why, I just really like that, and obligatory Whipwick mustache because, again, I don't know what it is, I just feel like it's so needed in most dragon creations. Now, I made the entirety of the head on the central neck of the Hydra, which by the way, the necks are made out of limbs, same technique as the tail, as the easiest way to make multiple identical heads in Spore is to make it all on the initial central neck, and then once I'm completely finished and happy with the design of the head, I will duplicate it down below the neck. That way I've still got like another central one, and with that duplicated one, I'll hold A for asymmetry and drag it to the right, and I'll do the same thing again and drag it to the left, and that way I've got two perfectly symmetrical heads. Now this makes my life 100 times easier because if I had instead placed the two crocodile heads on either neck and had them both be symmetrically mirrored, while they would be mirrored, it means I still have to individually place each part on their face. So it would only mirror one half of their face at a time, and I can really say from experience, trying to perfectly line up two asymmetrical eyes on a Hydra head is absolutely nightmarish. So my technique just then of doing it all in the middle, duplicating it, and then making it asymmetrical really saves a ton of headache. For the arms and legs, obligatory spikes. Of course, I just had to add more and more spikes. So in Alex's original creation, he has the underbelly as a bit of a light teal cyan kind of color, and it seemed a little bit weak on my creation since it is physically much larger. So I used the color spheres from Pandora's Toolbox as a makeshift underbelly coloring instead, and also to give the creature a bit more bulk. And as a result, it allowed me to use that particular color as a stripy pattern later on, which just kind of makes things a little bit more useful and gives it more detail and texturing. For the wings, of course, I went very large and grandiose, the typical Batboy technique. And then after that, it was a case of just adding more to the creature, since it felt like a little bit naked in a couple of places. And granted, Alex's creation didn't have a ton of detail. Like I mentioned earlier, I couldn't really just hold back in the Hydra. I wanted to add more and more. So I added a lot of the ichthyosaur part because I wanted it to be a bit of beige and white in various spots. That way, it just kind of gives it like a little bit more coloration overall. That was the vanilla ichthyosaur parts, by the way, not the recoloring replicant ones, but the original ones that you all have access to. And then adding a row of horror lumps across the necks and tails. And then after a little bit of experimenting with the coloration, we are done. This one I can definitely see being the big brother or even a parent of the original one, since it is just much larger. But hey, it's a Hydra, I really could not resist. Now for my fourth creation of the day, we got the Midnight Runner by Jacob Solar. Unfortunately, it seems that I don't have the footage of the process, which really sucks, and the live stream footage is very blurry and messy. So I can't really run over the process of this one, unfortunately, but ultimately you can see the before and after, which I'll just have playing for a little bit longer than usual. I did really keep to the original as much as I could because I really liked Jacob's original design. I like the posture and how it looked very timid and aerodynamic. I really like the color scheme. I like just the overall concept, and especially the head. The head was a part I really couldn't afford to deviate from in my one because it was such a clever idea of having one of the insect heads backwards, and so when the creature roars, the head kind of opens up into a sort of frill, and it was a really clever idea. I definitely wanted to keep and incorporate into my redesign, but otherwise, like I said, I can't really show the process, which really sucks. I basically just added a ton of feathers, a ton more integuments, quills, frills, etc., and made Jacob's Midnight Runner just kind of bigger, fluffier, and overall a bit more HD. For our fifth creature, we've got a bonus, as we are not quite finished yet, and that's a Ruscot by BentB9909. I've had a lot of people ask me if I'm only looking for quote-unquote good or detailed creatures. That's definitely not the case. I'm happy to accept all sorts of a variety, and that includes really lovely simplified ones like this because it gives me the great opportunity to turn it into a plushie, which I thought would be a lovely little surprise. A nice way to keep the creature as close to the original as possible, and yet still kind of making it different and refreshing. So we had the plushie Ruscot. And now for our sixth and final creation, which was chosen by you, the community, we had the Abyssal Lake Monster by Senor Gigaben. The Abyssal Lake Monster was such a badass creation, and one I really didn't want to touch because I really love the original. I thought Senor Gigaben did such a really fantastic job, so trying to recreate this one was a bit of a challenge because, again, I don't want to make like, a pure duplicate clone. So in the end, I decided for my one, I'd make it a little bit more armored. I quite literally tripled the amount of spikes along the back. I noticed his use of upside down nail downs along the arms and took that for a bit of armor, so I went ahead and dialed that up to 11 and added just lots of armor overall on the arms, on the shoulders, a bit around the back as well, and eventually on the tail. I kept their original claw design and just used different parts instead, just give it a bit of a different texture overall. Where they used the pull party foul part, I used the osteo flippy for the claws instead. The tail I kept about as same as the original because I quite liked the idea that they had even the vanilla exoskeleton limbs for a different coloration. I also defined the ribs of mine a little bit more because again, I just quite like the idea of it. And for the head, I did keep the head basically the same as the original, just with a couple of extra whip wicks along the head or the mouth. That way it kind of looked like it was just, you know, really big and snarling, and just kind of increased the overall sizing of it. Like I said, I really liked Gigaben's original creation, and I really didn't want to change the original design too much. I wanted to try and capture like certain really big key features, because I also saw this one's very popular among the community as well. If it ain't broke, don't fix, and this one's definitely not broken by the slightest. Now, like I mentioned, this one was the community voted one, and that does mean that this will be introduced into ZBrush as well, and I again had a bit of a struggle. It was a fun struggle, absolutely. So for this one, when it came to the overall ZBrush piece, after the obligatory initial start of cleaning up the mesh and separating all the spikes and certain key parts to making it look a bit more recognizable and organic, after that it was a case of just kind of playing with the mesh, and I thought I would go with something a little bit more experimental. Since my previous couple of creatures I tried to make things really neat, but for the abyssal lake monster, it really gives me the vibe of something that's just kind of very monstrous, very dark and eerie, probably covered in reeds or submerged in a lake often. And so for that, I thought like going with a bit of a messy sort of skin texture might be the right call, where everything's like a little bit lumpy, a little bit misshapen, bit of armor here and there or toughened areas, but overall not really anything covered in fur or scales, just lots of kind of flesh and skin. And so that meant a lot of experimenting with the clay build-up tool, the down standard tool as well, to add all the really highly defined lines and creases, and of course a couple of different alphas to try and give it a variety of folds, skin creases, wrinkles and such. I did add some of the most subtlest hues and scales here and there later on, especially on the tail and the back, but not really anything too defined. And then when it came to the coloration, again, kind of really going for something very experimental. I didn't really want to go too heavily on the patterns. I wanted it to look very murky, very dreary. Although the face, the mouth, I had to make that very big and fleshy colored. And while working on the face, some of the reds and oranges I was using did bleed through the mouth and around the neck. I quite liked how that looked, so I did decide to add a bit of red and orange to various other places on the creatures, such as in between the fingers and toes, a little bit around the shoulders and the ribs, sort of like fleshy or covered areas. Just give a bit of variety, but otherwise I tried to get the coloration as close to the original as I could, so mostly blues, greens and purples. And in the end, it got a very creepy looking creature. Definitely something out of my usual style and comfort zone, but definitely a very interesting one nonetheless, and like I mentioned earlier in the video, another great variety for the series overall. And there we have my 6 creations of the day, and such a wicked collection of creations at that. Congratulations to the lucky winners, and as always, if you guys want to submit your own creations, you may do so via my Discord server in the Remaking Creations channel, which is the one with the little star in it, which you may find in the video description down below. Thank you all so much once again for watching. It's been an absolute blast creating these, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care and have a wonderful day. Cheers.